Hello there. How are you? Urelli Crafts, you were first again, and as you came on, maybe I just don't look closely enough, but there were a whole bunch of little sort of welcome waves and hearts and stuff that flew up, so thank you for those too. Thank you everyone for joining me. My name's Gildart Jackson, and I have been doing these fireside readings since the start of the coronavirus lockdown. I thoroughly enjoy it. It's every day at 5 p.m. on Pacific time on the Instagram at Fireside Reading. All of the chapters are re-uploaded to the Fireside Reading YouTube channel. And I made a tiny little bit of a mistake. I forgot that this book ends very abruptly. And it ends very abruptly today. We'll get to the end of chapter 3, and chapter 4, which I had forgotten was quite so short, is only tiny, and we will get to the end of that today. So I had to make a quick decision. I have a selection of books that I'm interested in continuing with, and I made a quick decision, and I'm very excited that tomorrow I'm going to start reading The 39 Steps by John Buchan. It's an adventure, sort of almost, I suppose, the original adventure story. I read it as a boy. I remember very distinctly finding it at my grandparents' house, the old Penguin books that had a white strip in the middle and 2 orange strips at the top. And I read it voraciously in her garden when I was quite young, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And then I got to see the movie that Alfred Hitchcock made with Robert Donat, and it's a wonderful film. I would check it out, but if you can, please join me for the reading of the book, the entire book, unabridged, here in front of the fire. And this is another book that was written in installments and read by many people way back. I think it was written in 1915, something like that. I'm not quite sure about that, but I think I saw that today. But it was written in installments. People would go to the newsagent, bring it home, and read it in front of the fire, just like we're going to do. So tomorrow, please join me for chapter 1 of The 39 Steps by John Buchan. It's a really fun story. But today, we will continue and finish what I have found to be very interesting, the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. Really quite amazing, all the things that he did, and his industry, and his ability to get things done. As we said, had a few ideas that are fortunately no longer things that we believe in, but we can learn a lot, I think. I can learn a lot from the things that he did, which I admire. So, welcome to a fireside reading of the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. To begin, this is part 7 of chapter 3. If we remember, he was on a boat going to England. Our captain of the packet had boasted much before we sailed of the swiftness of his ship. Unfortunately, when we came to sea, she proved the dullest of 96 sail, to his no small mortification. After many conjectures respecting the cause, when we were near another ship almost as dull as ours, which, however, gained upon us, the captain ordered all hands to come aft and stand as near the ensign staff as possible. We were, passengers included, about 40 persons. While we stood there, the ship mended her pace and soon left her neighbor far behind, which proved clearly what our captain suspected, that she was loaded too much in the head. The casks of water, it seems, had been all placed forward. These he therefore ordered to be moved further aft, on which the ship recovered her character and proved the sailor in the fleet. The captain said she had once gone at the rate of 13 knots, which is accounted 13 miles per hour. We had on board as a passenger Captain Kennedy of the Navy, who contended that it was impossible, and that no ship ever sailed so fast, and that there must have been some error in the division of the log line, or some mistake in heaving the log. A wager ensued between the two captains to be decided when there should be sufficient wind. Kennedy thereupon examined rigorously the log line, and being satisfied with that, he determined to throw the log himself. Accordingly, some days after, when the wind blew very fair and fresh, and the captain of the packet, Lutwidge, said he believed she then went at the rate of 13 knots, Kennedy made the experiment and owned his wager lost. The above fact I give for the sake of the following observation. It has been remarked as an imperfection in the art of shipbuilding that it can never be known till she is tried whether a new ship will or will not be a good sailor, for that the model of a good sailing ship has been exactly followed in a new one which has proved, on the contrary, remarkably dull. I apprehend that this may partly be occasioned by the different opinions of seamen respecting the modes of lading, rigging, and sailing of a ship. Each has his system, and the same vessel, laden by the judgment and orders of one captain, shall sail better or worse than when by the orders of another. Besides, it scarce ever happens that a ship is formed, fitted for the sea, and sailed by the same person. One man builds the hull, another rigs her, a third lades and sails her. No one of these has the advantage of knowing all the ideas and experience of the others, and therefore cannot draw just conclusions from a combination of the whole. Even in the simple operation of sailing when at sea, I have often observed different judgments in the officers who commanded the successive watches, the wind being the same. One would have the sails trimmed sharper or flatter than another, so that they seemed to have no certain rule to govern by. Yet I think a set of experiments might be instituted, first to determine the most proper form of the hull for swift sailing, next the best dimensions and properest place for the masts, then the form and quantity of sails and their position as the wind may be, and lastly the disposition of the lading. This is an age of experiments, and I think a set accurately made and combined would be of great use. I am persuaded, therefore, that ere long some ingenious philosopher will undertake it, to whom I wish success. We were several times chased in our passage, but outsailed everything, and in 30 days had soundings. We had a good observation, and the captain judged himself so near our port, Falmouth, that if we made a good run in the night, we might be off the mouth of that harbour in the morning, and by running in the night might escape the notice of the enemy's privateers, who often cruised near the entrance of the channel. Accordingly, all the sail was set that we could possibly make, and the wind being very fresh and fair, we went right before it and made great way. The captain, after his observation, shaped his course, as he thought, so as to pass wide of the Scilly Isles, but it seems there is sometimes a strong indraft setting up St. George's Channel, which deceives seamen and caused the loss of Sir Cloudesley Shovel's squadron. This indraft was probably the cause of what happened to us. We had a watchman placed in the bow, to whom they often called, "Look well out before there," and he as often answered, "Aye, aye," but perhaps had shut eyes, and was half asleep at the time, they sometimes answering, as is said, mechanically, for he did not see a light just before us, which had been hid by the studding sails from the man at the helm and from the rest of the watch. but by an accidental yaw of the ship was discovered and occasioned a great alarm, we being very near it, the light appearing to me as big as a cartwheel. It was midnight, and our captain fast asleep. But Captain Kennedy, jumping upon deck and seeing the danger, ordered the ship to wear around, all sails standing, an operation dangerous to the masts, but it carried us clear, and we escaped shipwreck, for we were running right upon the rocks on which the lighthouse was erected. This deliverance impressed me strongly with the utility of lighthouses, and made me resolve to encourage the building more of them in America, if I should live to return there. In the morning it was found, by the soundings, etc., that we were near our port, but a thick fog hid the land from our sight. About 9 o'clock the fog began to rise, and seemed to be lifted up from the water like the curtain at a playhouse, discovering underneath the town of Falmouth, the vessels in its harbour and the fields that surrounded it. This was a most pleasing spectacle to those who had been so long without any other prospects than the uniform view of a vacant ocean, and it gave us the more pleasure as we were now free from the anxieties which the state of war occasioned. I set out immediately with my son for London, and we only stopped a little by the way to view Stonehenge on Salisbury Plain, and Lord Pembroke's house and gardens with his very curious antiquities at Wilton. We arrived in London the 27th of July, 1757. That is the end of chapter 3. Chapter 4. What follows was written in the last year of Dr. Franklin's life, and was first printed in English in Mr. Bigelow's edition of 1868 of his autobiography. As soon as I was settled in a lodging Mr. Charles had provided for me, I went to visit Dr. I'm going to start that bit again. As soon as I was settled in a lodging Mr. Charles had provided for me, I went to visit Dr. Fothergill, to whom I was strongly recommended, and whose counsel respecting my proceedings I was advised to obtain. He was against an immediate complaint to government, and thought the proprietaries should first be personally applied to, who might possibly be induced by the interposition and persuasion of some private friends to accommodate matters amicably. I then waited on my old friend and correspondent, Mr. Peter Collinson, who told me that John Hanbury, the great Virginia merchant, had requested to be informed when I should arrive, that he might carry me to Lord Granville's, who was then president of the council, and wished to see me as soon as possible. I agreed to go with him the next morning. Accordingly, Mr. Hanbury called for me, and took me in his carriage to that nobleman's, who received me with great civility, and after some questions respecting the present state of affairs in America and discourse thereupon, he said to me, "You Americans have wrong ideas of the nature of your Constitution. You contend that the King's instructions to his governors are not laws, and think yourselves at liberty to regard or disregard them at your own discretion. But those instructions are not like the pocket instructions given to a minister going abroad for regulating his conduct in some trifling point of ceremony. They are first drawn up by judges learned in the laws. They are then considered, debated, and perhaps amended in council, after which they are signed by the king. They are then, so far as they relate to you, the law of the land, for the king is the legislator of the colonies." I told his lordship this was new doctrine to me. I had always understood from our charters that our laws were to be made by our assemblies, to be presented indeed to the king for his royal assent, but that being once given, the king could not repeal or alter them. And as the assemblies could not make permanent laws without his assent, so neither could he make a law for them without theirs. He assured me I was totally mistaken. I did not think so, however, and his lordship's conversation having a little alarmed me as to what might be the sentiments of the court concerning us, I wrote it down as soon as I returned to my lodgings. I recollected that about 20 years before, a clause in a bill brought into Parliament by the ministry had proposed to make the King's instructions laws in the colonies, but the clause was thrown out by the Commons, for which we adored them as our friends and friends of liberty, till by their conduct towards us in 1765 it seemed that they had refused that point of sovereignty to the King, only that they might reserve it for themselves. After some days, Dr. Fothergill having spoken to the proprietaries, they agreed to a meeting with me at Mr. T. Penn's house in Spring Garden. The conversation at first consisted of mutual declarations of disposition to reasonable accommodations, but I suppose each party had its own ideas of what should be meant by reasonable. We then went into consideration of our several points of complaint, which I enumerated. The proprietaries justified their conduct as well as they could, and I the Assembly's. We now appeared very wide and so far from each other in our opinions as to discourage all hope of agreement. However, it was concluded that I should give them the heads of our complaints in writing, and they promised then to consider them. I did so soon after, but they put the paper into the hands of their solicitor, Ferdinand John Paris, who managed for them all their law business in their great suit with the neighbouring proprietary of Maryland, Lord Baltimore, which had subsisted 70 years, and wrote for them all their papers and messages in their dispute with the Assembly. He was a proud, angry man, and as I had occasionally in the answers of the Assembly treated his papers with some severity, they being really weak in point of argument and haughty in expression, he had conceived a mortal enmity to me, which, discovering itself whenever we met, I declined the proprietary's proposal that he and I should discuss the heads of complaint between our two selves, and refused treating with anyone but them. They then, by his advice, put the paper into the hands of the Attorney and Solicitor General for their opinion and counsel upon it, where it lay unanswered a year, wanting 8 days, during which time I made frequent demands of an answer from the proprietaries, but without obtaining any other than that they had not yet received the opinion of the Attorney and Solicitor General. What it was when they did receive it, I never learned, for they did not communicate it to me, but sent a long message to the Assembly, drawn and signed by Paris, reciting my paper, complaining of its want of formality, as a rudeness on my part, and giving a flimsy justification of their conduct, adding that they should be willing to accommodate matters if the Assembly would send out some person of candour to treat with them for that purpose, intimating thereby that I was not such. The want of formality or rudeness was probably my not having addressed the paper to them with their assumed titles of true and absolute proprietaries of the province of Pennsylvania, which I omitted as not thinking it necessary in a paper, the intention of which was only to reduce to a certainty by writing what in conversation I had delivered viva voce. But during this delay, the Assembly having prevailed with Governor Denny to pass an act taxing the proprietary estate in common with the estates of the people, which was the grand point in dispute, they omitted answering the message. When this act, however, came over, the proprietaries, counselled by Paris, determined to oppose its receiving the royal assent. Accordingly, they petitioned the king in council, and a hearing was appointed in which 2 lawyers were employed by them against the act and 2 by me in support of it. They alleged that the act was intended to load the proprietary estate in order to spare those of the people, and that if it were suffered to continue in force and the proprietaries, who were in odium with the people, left to their mercy in proportioning the taxes, they would inevitably be ruined. We replied that the act had no such intention and would have no such effect, that the assessors were honest and discreet men under an oath to assess fairly and equitably, and that any advantage each of them might expect in lessening his own tax by augmenting that of the proprietaries was too trifling to induce them to perjure themselves. This is the purport of what I remember as urged by both sides, except that we insisted strongly on the mischievous consequences that must attend a repeal, for that the money, £100,000, being printed and given to the king's use, expended in his service, and now spread among the people, the repeal would strike it dead in their hands, to the ruin of many, and the total discouragement of future grants, and the selfishness of the proprietors in soliciting such a general catastrophe, merely from a groundless fear of their estate being taxed too highly, was insisted on in the strongest terms. On this, Lord Mansfield, one of the council, rose, and beckoning me, took me into the clerk's chamber, while the lawyers were pleading, and asked me if I was really of opinion that no injury would be done the proprietary estate in the execution of the act. I said, certainly. Then, says he, you can have little objection to entering into an engagement to assure that point. I answered, none at all. He then called in Paris, and after some discourse, his lordship's proposition was accepted on both sides. A paper to the purpose was drawn up by the clerks of the council, which I signed with Mr. Charles, who was also an agent of the province for their ordinary affairs, when Lord Mansfield returned to the council chamber, where finally the law was allowed to pass. Some changes were, however, recommended, and we also engaged they should be made by a subsequent law, but the Assembly did not think them necessary. For 1 year's tax having been levied by the Act before the Order of Council arrived, they appointed a committee to examine the proceedings of the assessors, and on this committee they put several particular friends of the proprietaries. After a full inquiry, they unanimously signed a report that they found the tax had been assessed with perfect equity. The Assembly looked into my entering into the first part of the engagement as an essential service to the province, since it secured the credit of the paper money that spread all over the country. They gave me their thanks in form when I returned, but the proprietaries were enraged at Governor Denny for having passed the act and turned him out with threats of suing him for breach of instructions which he had given bond to observe. He, however, having done it at the instance of the general and for his Majesty's service, and having some powerful interests at court, despised the threats, and they were never put in execution. Unfinished. The chief events in Franklin's life. This is an addendum added by the man who put together the autobiography. Ending as it does with the year 1757, the autobiography leaves important facts unrecorded. It has seemed advisable, therefore, to detail the chief events in Franklin's life from the beginning in the following list. 1706, he is born in Boston and baptized in the Old South Church. 1714, at the age of 8, enters the grammar school. 1716 becomes his father's assistant in the tallow chandlery business. 1718 apprenticed to his brother James, printer. 1721 writes ballads and peddles them in printed form in the streets, contributes anonymously to the New England Courant and temporarily edits that paper, becomes a free thinker and a vegetarian. 1723 breaks his indenture and removes to Philadelphia, obtains employment in Keimer's printing office, abandons vegetarianism. 1724 is persuaded by Governor Keith to establish himself independently and goes to London to buy type, works at his trade there and publishes Dissertation on Liberty and Necessity, Pleasure and Pain. 1726 returns to Philadelphia. After serving as clerk in a dry goods store, becomes manager of Keimer's printing house. 1727 founds the Junto, or Leather Apron Club. 1728, with Hugh Meredith, opens a printing office. 1729 becomes proprietor and editor of the Pennsylvania Gazette, prints anonymously Nature and Necessity of a Paper Currency, opens a stationer's shop. 1730, marries Rebecca Reed. 1731, founds the Philadelphia Library. 1732, publishes the first number of Poor Richard's Almanac under the pseudonym of Richard Saunders. The almanac, which continued for 25 years to contain his witty, worldly-wise sayings, played a very large part in bringing together and molding the American character, which was at that time made up of so many diverse and scattered types. 1733 begins to study French, Italian, Spanish, and Latin. 1736, chosen clerk of the General Assembly, forms the Union Fire Company of Philadelphia. 1737, elected to the Assembly, appointed Deputy Postmaster General, plans a city police. 1742, invents the open or Franklin stove. 1743, proposes a plan for an academy, which is adopted, 1749, and develops into the University of Pennsylvania. 1744, establishes the American Philosophical Society. 1746, publishes a pamphlet, Plain Truth, on the necessity for disciplined defense, and forms a military company, begins electrical experiments. 1748, sells out his printing business, is appointed on the Commission of the Peace, chosen to the Common Council and to the Assembly. 1749, appointed a commissioner to trade with the Indians. 1751, aids in founding a hospital. 1752, experiments with a kite and discovers that lightning is an electrical discharge. 1753, awarded the Copley Medal for this discovery and elected a member of the Royal Society. Receives the degree of M.A. from Yale and Harvard, appointed Joint Postmaster General. 1754, appointed one of the commissioners from Pennsylvania to the Colonial Congress at Albany, proposes a plan for the Union of the Colonies. 1756, pledges his personal property in order that supplies may be raised for Braddock's army, obtains a grant from the Assembly in aid of the Crown Point expedition, carries through a bill establishing a voluntary militia, is appointed colonel, and takes the field. 1757 introduces a bill in the Assembly for paving the streets of Philadelphia, publishes his famous Way to Wealth, goes to England to plead the cause of the Assembly against the proprietaries, remains as agent for Pennsylvania, enjoys the friendship of the scientific and literary men of the kingdom. Here is when the autobiography breaks off. 1760 secures from the Privy Council, by a compromise, a decision obliging the proprietary estates to contribute to the public revenue. 1762 receives the degree of LL.D. from Oxford and Edinburgh, returns to America. 1763, makes a 5-month tour of the northern colonies for the purpose of inspecting the post offices. 1764, defeated by the Penn faction for the re-election to the Assembly, sent to England as an agent for Pennsylvania. 1765, endeavors to prevent the passage of the Stamp Act. 1766, examined before the House of Commons relative to the passage of the Stamp Act, appointed agent of Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Georgia, visits Göttingen University. 1767, travels in France and is presented at court. 1769, procures a telescope for Harvard College. 1772, elected Associé étranger of the French Academy. 1774, dismissed from the office of Postmaster General, influences Thomas Paine to emigrate to America. 1775, returns to America, chosen a delegate to the Second Continental Congress, placed on the Committee of Secret Correspondence, appointed one of the commissioners to secure the cooperation of Canada. 1776, placed on the committee to draft a Declaration of Independence, chosen president of the Constitutional Committee of Pennsylvania, sent to France as agent of the colonies. 1778, concludes treaties of defensive alliance and of amity and commerce, is received at court. 1779, appointed minister plenipotentiary to France. 1780, appoints Paul Jones, commander of the Alliance. 1782, signs the preliminary articles of peace. 1783, signs the definite treaty of peace. 1785, returns to America, is chosen president of Pennsylvania, re-elected 1786. 1787, re-elected president, sent as delegate to the convention for framing of federal constitution. 1788, retires from public life. 1790, April the 17th, dies. His grave is in the churchyard at 5th and Arch Streets in Philadelphia. Thank you all for joining me. I hope this helps a little, and I look forward to seeing you for a change of pace tomorrow for the action adventure, The 39 Steps, written by John Buchan. It's a wonderful story, and I hope you can join me for the Fireside Reading of Chapter 1 tomorrow at 5 Pacific at Fireside Reading on Instagram. Everything I put up a little after I've read it on the YouTube channel Fireside Reading. So until tomorrow, please be very well.